Hello everyone, thanks for joining me on Facebook Live and YouTube. I'm meteorologist Johanna Wagstaff. We've got Denny Dossman behind the camera, and we're here to answer your questions about why it's so cold and when it's going to end across the country. And we're also going to talk about the big weather storm, the big snowstorm headed towards Atlantic Canada in the next 24 hours. So we'll take your questions on Facebook Live and YouTube. Keep them coming. And again, thanks for joining. Just want to give you a brief overview before I take the questions. Some of you may have noticed it's been a little chilly as of late. The first blast of Arctic air moved down across much of the country early last week. It retreated a little bit yesterday, and now it's making its way back down across Ontario and Quebec for tomorrow into the weekend. Behind that, we've got another blast of Arctic air set to move across Western Canada into early next week. And all of this cold air is fuel for a storm that's tracking up the U.S. East Coast today. Major U.S. disruptions. That is going to turn into what we call a weather bomb when it hits the Maritimes tomorrow into tomorrow evening. Potentially very disruptive storms of the East Coast. So let's just get right to some of the questions. Behind me, I've got some of the current temperatures. If you want to take a look at where it is right now. Lloyd Jocelyn asks, it's cold. Is it cold because of global warming? Let's get right to it. Good question. It's often confusing when we're dealing with well below seasonal temperatures. In fact, record-breaking temperatures, historic stretches of cold weather. But in fact, more and more research is connecting these cold snaps to climate change. So I want to show you something again. These are current temperatures across the country. You can see these dark purple colors. That's part of that Arctic air mass, or the polar vortex, as you may have heard about in the news. So as I take you to another graphic here, just want to show you the bigger picture happening right now across the globe. So these white and purple temperatures, that's the polar vortex. That's just a term that meteorologists use to explain the circulation of air that's always happening along up in the poles, both the north and south poles. We always see our extreme coldest temperatures rotating around the poles. When we have very strong temperature differences between the north and the south, that cold air stays locked up in the north. But when temperature differences aren't as great, the jet stream really meanders. And I want to show you what the jet stream looks like today, in fact, and you can see how meandering it is. So here's our current temperatures. Add on the jet stream, you can see it rises high in the west, dives down in the south, and that allows part of the polar vortex to break off and spread down across the country. So the question is this related to climate change? More research saying that we've got more meandering jet streams with climate change because we're seeing less of a temperature difference with a warming Arctic. That allows that jet stream to meander more. That allows the polar vortex to break off more often, and we see these deep freezes. The first one we really saw in the media anyway was 2014. A YouTube viewer asks, for people living up north, like in the Northwest Territories, this is probably summer for them. Can you elaborate? Yeah, going back to some of these current temperatures, let me just make this map a little bigger for you. You can see all these greens and blues off in the west. It is 1 degree in Anchorage, Alaska. It is 0 in through Whitehorse. It is much colder in places like Toronto, even Chicago, even U.S. Midwest states are colder than Canada's north. And again, it's because of that meandering jet stream. All of that Arctic air was displaced from the north, and the atmosphere is always trying to balance that energy out. So we've got warmer temperatures rising up in the west to balance out those cold airs. This jet stream, by the way, not only acts as a boundary between air masses, but as a conveyor belt for storms. You can see where it's headed on the East Coast. This conveyor belt is going to carry up a very potent storm for the East Coast, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. By the way, if you're just joining us on YouTube or Facebook, talking cold and winter storms, keep those questions coming. Dave Brooks asks, what records are we breaking? So we are breaking a number of records across the country for daily cold temperature records. Mainly morning temperatures across most of the country. We're seeing that bit of a warm up in Western Canada as of late, but morning temperatures have been down around -30 for our major cities. That's about 15 to 20 degrees below seasonal, and we are breaking daily temperature records. We're also breaking records as far as how long this cold stretch lasts. Montreal just broke an all-time record for longest stretch of cold temperatures below -16 degrees. I think you had 6 days and counting of temperatures that didn't rise above -16. Carolyn Vesey asks, is PEI getting that storm? Yeah, let's get to some of the storm details right now, because it is connected to the cold weather. So I'm just going to take you to, first of all, the watches and warnings in Canada. So you can see here the yellows are the watches, which means the storm is coming but hasn't materialized yet. The warning in place for PEI, eastern New Brunswick and western and northern Nova Scotia. So this is where we do have a winter storm warning in effect. These conditions will deteriorate rapidly through the overnight, Thursday overnight into Friday. This is where we're talking a full-blown blizzard, and you may have heard the media or meteorologists use the term a weather bomb. This is actually a meteorological term. We call it bombogenesis, and that's when we get a storm deepening so rapidly in a short amount of time. The central pressure of a storm actually has to drop 24 millibars in 24 hours for it to be considered a weather bomb, and we call it bombing out when a storm does this. When we get these weather bombs, it means they're very intense. We're looking at very strong winds and very big snowfalls, which is why the impact to Atlantic Canada is so great. The risk is so great for widespread power outages and whiteout conditions with hurricane force winds on top of snowfall totals that could be over 40 centimeters. So I just want to time it out for you really quickly. This is actually impacting the U.S. East Coast states today. Watch as I time this storm out. So we've got a couple of things happening. We've got this cold air across the west, actually merging with this storm that's sliding up the east coast. Watch these. I've actually left the pressure rings around this low pressure on. The closer these yellow bars are, the lower the pressure, the greater the winds around that low pressure. So here's Thursday a.m. These two systems are merging. We get that cold air being brought into the center of this storm. Here's Thursday 6 p.m. Look at how tight these bars are. Winds at that point Thursday evening will be over 100 kilometers per hour. You can see the blues. That's the heavy snow accumulating. Oh, I've lost my model for a second. As this storm tracks off towards the north for the weekend, we're going to get very cold temperatures wrap in behind it. So everyone without power for the weekend is going to also have to deal with very cold temperatures. And that's why you've probably heard a lot of this storm, even though it's really not going to really start ramping up for the next 24 hours. Cheryl Lease asks, is the jet stream moving more to the east? Yeah, we're getting some great questions here about the bigger picture. Just want to take you back to my big picture where we're talking jet stream. As I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons why we're seeing these cold Arctic outbreaks is because the jet stream is so meandering, allowing that Arctic air to move down from the north. So the jet stream doesn't actually move west to east, but what it does is undulates or meanders. Sometimes we get the jet stream moving straight from west to east, and we get weather systems that move across quite quickly. We get really seasonal temperatures across the country. It's when we get this really undulating pattern that we often get our severe weather. So the storm that I'm tracking moving into the east coast of the U.S., it's going to ride that jet stream up right into the Maritimes and Atlantic Canada, which is why it's so potent. And again, tapping into that cold air, it's going to become an explosive storm system. Let's see, these are great questions. Again, if you're just joining us from Facebook or YouTube, I'm meteorologist Johanna Wagstaff. Blake Marks asks, given that the cold air is affecting parts of North America at the same latitudes as Africa, would this cold weather also have effects on Africa? Yeah, interesting question about the bigger picture. So I'm going to take you back to one look I have here. Actually, let's see if I can open this up and move the map around as we talk. But it's all about air masses being displaced. It's not uniform at the same latitude. And again, it's because of that meandering jet stream. So you can see these whites and pinks, that's the Arctic air. You can see how it's basically moving down across eastern Canada as we speak. Let's spin the map around though, and you can see these warmer colors as we slide off towards the east. In fact, it looks like there's a little bit of a warm up, probably to balance out that cold air that's moved down across North America. As a result, some warmer temperatures have moved up into parts of Europe, into the north. I know the UK was dealing with that big storm because of these temperature contrasts. So areas around the same latitude definitely not dealing with the same weather, and it's all about balancing things out. And again, you can see how far south this Arctic air mass has reached. In fact, I want to take you over to this screen actually. Just to give you an idea of how widespread this cold air is, this is a look at the National Weather Service watches and warnings. You can see on the East Coast all of these purples and pinks from basically the U.S. Gulf Coast, where they're under flash freeze warnings, all the way from Florida to northern Maine. The U.S. East Coast is under some type of winter weather warning, and that's all to do with the same system that's going to eventually bomb out as it hits our cold air and hit Atlantic Canada. A few viewers are asking about the storm in the UK. Admittedly, I haven't looked at the meteorological details, but I know that storm hit a couple of days ago, and we're still seeing a winter weather, probably all connected to the same jet stream. Let's see if I can bring in the current winds. This is a look at the winds around the world right now. The jet stream often comes up from the Canada East Coast and then travels across the Atlantic. So the UK often gets storms that have migrated west to east. It looks like there's still very strong winds impacting the UK right now. I don't know if you can see these wind bars moving west to east. Looks like the center of the storm has now moved over towards Scandinavia. So we're still seeing very cold and very strong winds across the UK right now. Yeah, not connected to the systems we're getting in the west, but our jet streams are all connected. Canadian watcher on YouTube asks, is this normal this time of the year? That's a good question. It is winter in Canada, so we do get these cold outbreaks happening. This isn't normal, but this isn't totally unusual, but there are some interesting aspects to this particular cold outbreak. As I mentioned earlier, more and more research is showing a connection between these undulating jet streams and a warming climate. So we're getting more Arctic air outbreaks across the country. In general, our temperatures are still going up across the world on average. In fact, yesterday, new research showed that 2017 was the hottest year around the world without an El Nino, which is the global phenomenon that raises Earth's temperature. So we were hotter even without an El Nino last year than ever before. So it is normal that we see these outbreaks, but we're seeing them over longer periods of time. They're more extreme, they're happening more frequently, and that is connected to a changing climate. Elvin Shen asks, why is it so cold when there's a global warming issue in the world currently? Yeah, that comes back to the fact that when the planet warms, it doesn't warm evenly. We're actually seeing warming in the Arctic faster than we're seeing it around the equator. We're seeing warming happening in the poles faster than anywhere else. So normally, or in the past, we had quite a sharp temperature difference between the Arctic and the tropics. But now that difference, or the subtropics, now that difference isn't as strong, and so the jet stream isn't as zonal. It's undulating more because the Arctic's warming so fast. That's allowing these Arctic outbreaks to move down south. And as I mentioned, at the same time that we're seeing that cold air down south, parts of the Arctic around Europe are actually record-breaking warm right now. So it's all about balancing that energy out. And sometimes global warming, climate change doesn't necessarily mean warmer weather, it just means more extreme weather when we're talking weather. Cloud Shisson asks, can we access this map online to monitor the air masses? So this weather map that shows the winds, that is available free online. It's Earth Null School. If you just Google Earth Null School or Global Wind Map, you can access these instantaneous winds anywhere around the world. One of my favorite places to check air masses is Environment Canada. This is kind of a complicated map, but you can go into Environment Canada's model page, check upper air analysis, and that's where I'm able to see the jet stream pattern. And this is also where we monitor if there's going to be a polar outbreak. We can tell if the jet stream is going to be modulating like we're seeing it right now, whether or not there's going to be an Arctic outbreak in the future. The weather graphics on my right, these are actually supplied by a weather company that we use that basically turns all of the weather data into a graphical representation, but you can get most of these maps and models through Environment Canada. Charles Potter asks, why does it get super cold on the East Coast, but here in Vancouver, it's like 3 degrees? So yeah, that comes back to the jet stream again. Typically, it is warmer and more mild on the West Coast because of the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean along Vancouver's West Coast is much milder than the Atlantic coast, and because generally systems move west to east, we're always getting a milder air mass coming in from the west that modifies our temperatures here on the West Coast. So yeah, right now it's 3 degrees in Vancouver. It's -22 in Winnipeg, a -6 in through Toronto. Earlier in the week and last week, we actually saw that air mass spread westward. So we did see some very unusually cold temperatures in Vancouver. If you're watching from here, you know it was -10. We had that big ice storm in Chilliwack and Abbotsford last week. That's that same air mass that pushed westward. Now that jet stream, let's add the jet stream on, is riding high to the west. So that's allowing all these warm temperatures, or milder temperatures, I should say, to move back up. Again, these are great questions. If you're just joining us from Facebook or YouTube, I'm meteorologist Johanna Wagstaff. We've got Denis behind the camera. Mike Barnett via CBC Montreal, where you just broke an all-time coldest stretch record, asks, since it's colder now, do you think we will have an early spring and we may heat up in May? Yes. That is an interesting thought. Will the cold temperatures and severe outbreaks we're seeing affect what kind of spring we have? Will that, energy equation balance out a little earlier? It's really hard to say. Long-range climate models indicate that we're actually going into a La Nina weather phenomenon. That's the Pacific Arctic or the Pacific equatorial temperatures that change weather patterns all around the world. Typically, La Nina for Canada normally means a slightly colder winter, and it looks like La Nina is really going to establish itself early winter into the spring. So it does look like the trends are for a colder spring, but again, we're talking severe weather in this case. So we may see some pretty extremes as far as temperatures go over the next few months. Let's see. Again, great questions here. Richard Lovell asks, nobody ever links Eastern Canada weather and the UK, but we do get a lot of weather from you. Oh, Richard watching from the UK. It's true. As I mentioned, these jet streams, they continue all around the world. When you hear people talk about the jet stream, it isn't just a stream of fast-moving air in the upper atmosphere that moves across North America. These wrap around the entire globe. So the weather systems often follow these jet streams. Jet streams act a bit like a conveyor belt because they're the fastest moving stream in the atmosphere. They're carrying the storm that's hitting the East Coast tomorrow night. They're going to carry it across the Atlantic. It's going to modify over the ocean, and it's going to modify once it hits different air masses in place across Europe. But yeah, Europe and UK often gets weather systems from us. In fact, they sometimes even get hurricanes from the Atlantic that make their way all across. Let's see, lots of great questions. Preston Kenneth Moore asks, are we suspected to get another cold snap here in Saskatchewan? Yeah, I was hoping someone would ask about the long-range forecast. Let me take you back here. Really giving Denis a workout with the back and forth. So this is a long-range outlook. Again, the purples and the yellows, the Arctic air. It retreated a little bit over the past couple of days, but watch as I take you through. Let's stop here on Friday. So here's Friday. That Arctic air moves back down across Ontario and Quebec. We're going to look at -30 wind chills again for the major cities across Ontario and Quebec. Then all of this cold air is going to become fuel for that weather bomb hitting the East Coast Thursday and Friday. And in fact, once we see all of the snow dump across the Maritimes, by Sunday, that Arctic air mass is going to move back in behind. And that's why we have so much concern for this storm in the East Coast. If we see those hurricane force winds and snowfall totals lead to widespread power outages, then everyone's going to be in the cold without power for the weekend. And that's because, again, that Arctic air mass is tracking west to east. Back to the prairies, though. So taking you back to this map, here's Sunday. That one Arctic air mass is now locked up in the east. Watch this. Another one starts to move down from the north for early next week. So we are not done with the Arctic air. It looks like we get a fresh surge of that polar vortex. It's going to spread down across the prairies. Your temperatures are going to go right back down to the -20 overnight lows starting early next week. So you're not in the clear yet. Robert Elric asks, did the smoke from California have any causes for change in the North America climate lately? Interesting question, and I know researchers are looking closely at the impacts of smoke on the climate. It's often a bigger, smoke often plays a bigger role with volcanoes and that ash leading to long-term changes in the climate. So I'm not sure if there was any direct impact on our seasons, but I know researchers will be looking to see if there is any impact from the big California wildfires. Jason Koblowski asks, do you think Ontario with this latest cold snap gets ice quakes like we saw a few years back during cold weather? Great question. And in fact, earlier this morning, I just heard reports of ice quakes in the Alberta area. So any of you watching in and around Edmonton, you may have heard those ice quakes last night, getting reports of even some damage or cracks in the house. Ice quakes happen when temperatures get so cold so fast that the groundwater actually freezes up, and that quick freeze can actually cause cracks in the ground and sometimes in the corresponding foundation to houses above. Now we've seen a little bit of a rapid warm up in the prairies, so as that groundwater is rapidly melting, again, ice quakes are a common occurrence. So yeah, we might see ice quakes in other parts of the country across the prairies. Ontario and Quebec often gets these ice quakes when we see these rapid changes in temperatures. So if you hear a loud bang in the middle of the night, they're usually not larger than a magnitude 2. They can be quite alarming. Ron Forth asks, is there a way to find the average temperature of Earth at any given time, say a fine grid network of surface temperature readings or a combination of satellite temperature readings? If it's possible to do this, what is the average doing? Yeah, interesting question. That is what agencies like NASA, the National Weather Service, UK Met Office, these big global climate organizations are doing. They're collecting a network of data and taking the average for global temperatures. And that's how we found out that 2017 was the warmest average temperature for Earth without an El Nino in place. That information just coming to us yesterday. So the big networks are taking the averages of these temperatures. I don't think I have a number for you right now as far as what the average global temperature at this given moment is. We do know that the global average temperature has risen 1 degree since pre-industrial levels. And just to keep things in context, the Paris Climate Accord is trying to keep that global warming below 2 degrees. Again, we've already warmed 1 full degree, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that is really what is leading to some of these extremes around the world. Wakar Youngus asks, what about snow forecasts for Vancouver in January and February? Yes, an often asked question around this time of the year. Again, we are heading into a bit of a La Nina. It's a weaker La Nina, and it's not expected to really take hold until the late winter months into spring, but that often means a snowier forecast for the West Coast. So hard to say. Likely not going to be as extreme as the snow we saw on the West Coast last year, but chances are we're going to see at least average snow here on the West Coast. Great questions I'm getting in. Ronnie Burt asks, can you write me a note so I can avoid driving to work in Halifax tomorrow? Yes, meteorologist Johanna Wagstaff says, good idea to stay off the roads tomorrow. Why don't I show you a look at some of the snow totals expected on the East Coast? We've been talking a lot about this cold snap. These cold temperatures are actually going to be supplying some of the fuel for this big weather bomb we've been talking about that's hitting the East Coast starting Thursday. So here's Thursday morning. We're going to start to see light snow spread across the Maritimes. As we head into Thursday evening, you can see these darker blues ramp up from the south. That's as we get that big storm that's tracking up the U.S. East Coast right now, merging with that cold air. So by Thursday, 8 p.m., we could already see accumulations on the ground in the central Maritimes, close to 20 to 40 centimeters. And then we get those very strong northeasterly winds. Some forecast models are predicting wind gusts up to 140 kilometers per hour. That's where we're talking blizzard and whiteout conditions and widespread power outages. Let me keep this going through to Friday. Here's Friday, 8 a.m. You can see these dark blue colors. 40 to 60 centimeters, not out of the question for the central Maritimes. And you can see snow spreading across Atlantic Canada as well. We'll see less snow towards the Nova Scotia coast, where we're getting some mixing with rain, freezing rain, not out of the questions. But for everyone, wind is going to be a big issue Thursday night through Friday for Atlantic Canada. Again, this is what we call a bombogenesis. When we see a low pressure system strengthen so rapidly, we see explosive conditions like what we're expecting on the West Coast. Salema Estrada via CBC Montreal asks, will this weather keep airlines grounded? Definitely keep checking if you have any flights expected across anywhere in the country over the next couple of weeks. Very cold weather means we need extra time for de-icing in many of the airports, so definitely check for delays. And this big storm is not only going to affect Atlantic Canada, but it's actually hitting the U.S. mid-Atlantic states today, sliding up through all the major hubs, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Washington. They're all getting hit with a major winter storm over the next 48 hours. So yeah, that could have trickle-down effects on all the airlines. In the next 48 hours, I expect we'll see a lot of delays and disruptions. So make sure you check your flights before you head out. And as I was asked about writing a note to stay home from work, this is definitely going to have impacts on ground travel in the East Coast as well. Katie McInnes asks, how bad will the storm heading for the Maritimes be, in particular PEI? So PEI is in a bit of the bullseye as far as the winds and the snow totals go. PEI could be seeing snow totals over 40 centimeters with wind gusts over 100 kilometers per hour. Just want to point you to my colleague here in the East Coast, Kaylin Mitchell, the meteorologist for the Maritimes. I know he's busy in his weather center right now. So if you're in the Maritimes watching and you want to follow this storm along, Kaylin's on Twitter and Facebook. Kaylin CBC on Twitter, Kaylin Mitchell on Facebook. And he's going to be tracking the storm out for you over the next couple of days. And he's got some great information on regions to really time the storm out for your particular neck of the woods. And Ryan Snodden, of course, is the meteorologist in Atlantic Canada if you're looking for details on Newfoundland. Donna Patterson-Rayleigh asks, it's been cold in Mobile, Alabama, down to -3. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, this big cold snap is impacting such a huge portion of North America. Taking you back to my big picture here, these yellow and purple temperatures, that's the Arctic air mass. You can see how far down south it goes. In fact, I think I've got another map. Let me open this one up. We can take a look at some of the temperatures down south. I think I may have even moved the map and added some temperatures. Yes. So Jacksonville, 1 degree right now, Nashville 2. Earlier in the week for New Year's Eve, we were seeing temperatures at the freezing mark for the Gulf states, and that was all the same air mass impacting Canada. So that just gives you an idea of how widespread and far-reaching this polar vortex was. A little bit of a recovery today, still well below seasonal, but as we head out into the forecast, we're going to be seeing temperatures drop across the U.S. As I mentioned, there is a flash freeze warning in place for the next couple of days for the southern Gulf states with that same air mass. If you're just joining us, thank you. I'm meteorologist Johanna Wagstaff. Your comments have been great on Facebook and Twitter. I think we've got a time for a few more questions. Holly Adams asks, are we in Manitoba going to see any good storms anytime soon? Manitoba needs more snow for the fields. Yeah, you're right. It's been very cold, but precipitation in general has been down across much of the prairies. And unfortunately, I'm not looking at any big weather maker. It all has to do with that jet stream. It's really undulating high across the west, allowing warm air to move in as we speak. But then we're going to get that fresh Arctic air move back in through early next week. But the jet stream really isn't carrying any storms across the Maritimes. They're carrying all the storms through to Atlantic Canada. So in the next 10 days or so, I don't see any replenishing snow forecast for the prairies, but things can change really quickly. So we'll hope that that jet stream moves into a more zonal flow, maybe in the next 10 plus days, and then we can get some good precipitation back for the prairies. Again, great questions. I think I can take a couple more at least, if that's okay. Let's see. Ice quakes, great question. Yeah, another question about from Derek Stephen McPhail. Is there a relationship between this extreme cold weather and the disruption of the Gulf Stream by ice melt in Greenland and northern Canada? Yeah, going back to that jet stream once again, I'll go to this air mass, this picture showing you the big picture of the air masses. The more we see the Arctic warm, and it has been pretty drastic in the past few years, the more we see our jet stream undulate around the world, the more we see these cold and hot outbreaks, air mass outbreaks, I should say. It's the same undulating jet stream that led to the extreme fire conditions in BC over the summer, and again, the extreme fire conditions in California just this past month. It was that big undulating jet stream that causes weather conditions to stay in place for days on end. Normally, we see more of a zonal flow, so things are more seasonal, systems move across the continent more quickly, but when we get this jet stream locking systems in place, like this cold air, that's when we end up with extreme weather. So yeah, the warming of the Arctic is certainly having an impact on the jet streams, which changes our extreme weather all around the world. Good question about the prairie snow. We are going to see more cold temperatures coming in. Cheryl Kearney asks, are you predicting any large snowfall amounts with this cold front? So yeah, I think you're alluding to the big system hitting the East Coast as we head into Thursday night. There are weather warnings in place. If you're watching from Atlantic Canada, definitely pay attention to those watches and warnings. This storm is going to be very disruptive. In fact, we haven't seen a storm, if the models are accurate, drop this quickly and this low in quite some time, and that's why we call it a weather bomb. When we see the central pressure drop more than 24 millibars in 24 hours, that's what we call a weather bomb or bombogenesis. That's what's going to be happening over the next couple of days as the storm moves into Atlantic Canada. So that equals big snowfall totals as we get Atlantic moisture merging with that cold air and hurricane force winds. So definitely snow totals up around 40 plus centimeters, followed by very cold air. I'm gonna wrap it up. Your questions have been excellent. In a nutshell, yes, it has been very cold across the country. We're in a bit of a break right now. Friday into Saturday, Ontario and Quebec, heads up, that cold air returns to you. Thursday into Friday, that cold air becomes fuel for a massive winter storm headed for the East Coast. Big disruptions expected. Then as we head into early next week, a fresh surge of cold air moves down across the prairies. We're not done with winter yet. So thanks again for joining. I'll see if I can get to some of your questions afterwards on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for Denis for handling the camera. Stay warm and we'll talk again soon. Thanks.